Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Congressman Krishnamoorthi, and thank you so much for joining this fireside chat with the very eminent Richard Haass, who is, it's a real treat to be able to speak with him today about a lot of topics that a lot of people are talking about these days, whether it's tariffs, whether it's China, whether it's Ukraine, and how it affects our everyday world. We have the exact right person to talk to today. In fact, he's written 14 books about foreign policy, including one titled The World, A Brief Introduction. And so I really look forward to hearing what he has to say. Dr. Haass is President Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations, where he was president for 20 years. Before that, he served at the State Department as a close advisor to then Secretary of State Colin Powell. He holds the rank of ambassador and was U.S. coordinator for policy toward the future of Afghanistan, and he was U.S. envoy to the Northern Ireland peace process. So as you can tell, few people are better positioned to talk about the world than Richard Haass. If it's okay with you, Dr. Haass, I'd like to invite you to make a few comments at the start, and then we'll turn to questions. But I have to tell you from the get-go that this audience, which I think is going to number in the hundreds, is going to want to hear first about anything that you find interesting, but especially about tariffs. This is something that we are hearing about daily in most of our congressional offices, especially from small businesses, but also from farmers, and of course from people who go to the grocery store and notice that everything costs a little more now than that it did last week. As you know, I'm the ranking member of the Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party, and of course, this tariff situation is, to say unusual would be the understatement of the week. And we want to let you first start with your comments. So thank you, Richard.
Well, good to be with you and everyone who's joining us virtually. I was going to make some comments about China and U.S.-China relations, but maybe I'll put those aside since you asked particularly about tariffs. So let me just say that tariffs can be a justified or warranted tool, particularly when another country is gaming trade in ways that are unfair, were never intended. For example, if there's all sorts of subsidies that make the product or service much cheaper than it should be, or if they're specifically dumping it. By that, I mean putting large quantities of it, sending them to the United States at artificially lowered prices in order to grab market share. And then once they gain the market share, presumably then they would be in a position to raise their prices to a much more natural level or even higher than that. So when we detect situations like that, by we I mean the United States, and we can't persuade another country to mend their ways, then yes, tariffs can be justified, but they ought to be, targeted and quite specific. The problem with the tariffs as they're now used is they're anything but. They're not targeted. They are across the board. I don't think they're warranted. It's not clear exactly what's motivating them. The Trump administration at various times has used a range of rationales. Sometimes it is to simply undo a trade imbalance, i.e. that we import from some country more than we sell to them. Well, there's nothing automatically wrong about that. It may simply be that they sell more of what we want, and they buy from others in addition to ourselves the things they want. We don't need to have bilateral trade balances with everyone any more than you have a bilateral trade balance with your tailor or with your dry cleaner or your grocer. We have imbalances with virtually everyone in our lives. So there's nothing wrong with imbalances. So why we're motivated to deal with them in this way, quite honestly, is beyond me. There's an entire school and theory of economics that essentially argues imbalances are healthy and inevitable, simply because, again, they reflect what's known as the comparative advantage of certain countries to produce certain goods or services more cheaply or better quality than others. Sometimes the rationale for tariffs seems to be to what's known again in economics literature as import substitution, to create a wall behind which we can revive American manufacturing. Well, look, most of the jobs that we've lost over the decades have not come from foreign imports. They've come from new technologies that have reduced the need for high levels of manpower to produce things. So this is, again, there's no match between what we're doing and what the problem is. But by using these tariffs, particularly unilaterally, we're angering our trade partners and allies. They're not being treated any better. If anything, they're being treated worse because most of our trade tends to be with friends. Not surprisingly, tariffs will raise prices. So yes, they'll collect some revenue, but ultimately the higher costs will be passed on. What we learned historically in recent years is then when we have tariffs, say against steel and aluminum, industries that use steel and aluminum, say cars or construction, they then have to pass on those costs to would-be consumers. And guess what? Those would-be consumers don't become actual consumers because they're frightened off by the higher prices. So I can go on, but for any number of reasons, economic as well as political, I don't think the tariffs are wise. They will generate higher levels of inflation. They will slow economic growth. They will increase unemployment. So I think it's just an unfortunate detour we have taken, and I'm afraid that it risks at a minimum stagflation, slower economy with inflation, worse yet, recession. And I think it's also introduced a degree of uncertainty and almost unreliability. We've heard our reputation, and the old saw, Congressman, that it takes a lifetime to build a reputation, but only a minute to burn one. Well, we're burning our reputation as a reliable, predictable, trustworthy partner. And for what? It's not as though it's going to help our economy. So I could go on, but I'll use a word that you're familiar with. I won't filibuster. I look forward to a conversation with you and with others.
Well, it looks like we have about 230 people and we have questions streaming in already. And by the way, if I've been instructed to tell everyone to use the Q&A function, which you see on the Zoom toolbar at the bottom to submit your questions. Maybe I'll kick it off here first with China. Look, you know this better than anyone. Right now, I believe the tariff that we are imposing on Chinese products is 145% across the board. The Chinese are imposing a 125% tariff across the board on ours. How do you see this unfolding? Based on what you know about the Chinese government, how do you see them responding, and what should we know about this?
Look, the U.S.-Chinese trade relationship is an enormous relationship. There's a large imbalance where we import much more than we export, but we have chosen to do that for many reasons. We can get imports of things we want, we don't produce. To China, we sell all sorts of things, particularly agricultural products, energy, some manufactured items, and so forth. A lot of the trade I would call non-strategic. A small part of the trade with China is high technology issues, and there we've got to be more careful in what we're willing to share. And I'm not going to sit here and defend Chinese trade practices. Over the years, they have subsidized. They haven't been involved in what's called intellectual property theft. No, quite honestly, when we supported China's entry into the World Trade Organization just over 2 decades ago, we hope that it would usher in a series of changes to make China more market-oriented, less repressive, more moderate in its foreign policy. And quite honestly, those things haven't come to pass. That said, for all those frustrations and flaws, much of the U.S.-Chinese trade relationship has served the interests of the United States as well as China. Right now, we've got these high tariffs which effectively end trade. What's happening is China's finding other places to export to. We'll have to look around. It won't be that easy. It'll hurt both countries. The old line about wars. In wars, there's no winners, only losers. That's true of trade wars as well. So this trade war, the longer it goes on, will hurt both the United States and China. It'll take a big chunk out of each country's economic growth. No good will come of it. The optimist in me, it's a rare word, I'm not usually associated with optimism, though thinks that we got to where we got less by design and more by a misreading of signals. This was a failure of diplomacy, I guess I would call it. My guess is then the two countries are looking for and will find a way to unwind, if not all of this, a good deal of it. Might come in phases. I could imagine it a first phase where there's a reduction in the mutual tariffs to less unreasonable levels. And I can imagine down the road, this will take much more time. President Trump has talked about a big deal with China. Well, big deals take a bit of time to negotiate, and there could be trade aspects, there could be political aspects, geopolitical aspects. I don't know the details. That's to be determined. The United States and China have, in some ways, the most important and most complex relationship in the world. So there's a lot you could put on the table. But my guess is ultimately we get there. So I think there'll still be tariffs. First of all, there's the 10% across the board tariff that affects everybody, and there'll be some specific China tariffs. Some will be warranted, I would say, because of unfair Chinese trade practices. Some might be more politically inspired, might be inspired by also things like fentanyl exports, which are important to stop, or the precursors of fentanyl. So I think this, but I do think, again, since both countries stand to lose from where we are, and ultimately governments tend to act in their self-interest, my prediction is that the two governments find a way, probably in phases, to de-escalate this trade war.
Wow. Well, we have a number of questions coming in. It's like we're going to go around the world in like 30 minutes here. So maybe we'll go to Ukraine, because I have one of the biggest concentrations of Polish Americans of any congressional district in the country. And so I think a lot of them are, and Ukrainians, by the way, Ukrainian Americans in Chicago. So we have a lot of people who are very intensely interested in this issue. Where do you see things right now? I think a lot of people feel Donald Trump was correct to try to begin the negotiation process, but they are mystified about where it's gone from there. And so can you give us a sense of where we're at and where this is going?
Yeah, I'm glad there's interest in it. There should be. It's in some ways, in immediate terms, the most significant geopolitical challenge out there. But the good news is that 3 years after this second Russian invasion of Ukraine, Ukraine is still holding its own. Essentially, the battle lines are not much different today than they were just over 3 years ago. It's been an extraordinary accomplishment by Ukraine, obviously, with American and European economic and military and intelligence help. That said, Russia can bring a lot more to it, just given the size of its economy, its manpower advantages. But Russia's been paying enormous costs. And I think this president was right to say this war has gone on way too long, and we're going to try to bring it to an end. I think in principle that was good. The problem is, the devil's in the details. And for reasons that continue to mystify me, the administration has essentially tilted towards Russia. And the package of proposals they put forward, I think, unwisely introduced what I would call final status permanent issues, which need not and should not be introduced at this stage of the negotiation. Look, I was the U.S. envoy to Northern Ireland. I was the U.S. envoy to Cyprus for the negotiations. I did years of Middle East talks and India-Pakistan talks. And one of the things you want to do is make ceasefires as clean and as simple as possible. They don't, by not trying to solve everything, you'll actually increase the odds you can get a ceasefire. And then it may take you years or decades to get a formal peace. But in the meantime, it's not that bad. It's certainly an awful lot better than war. So I think the administration has made a mistake by introducing these so-called final status issues about Crimea, about the eastern provinces, and worse yet, it's introduced them in a way that essentially embraces the Russian position. And it would undermine our own principle that territory ought not to be acquired by force. So I think Ukraine is right. It's understandable that it's saying no. I would hope the administration would rethink its position. Clearly, by the way, Vladimir Putin's not interested in peace. It's not his priority. He wants to stall, and he's hoping that American support for Ukraine fades and that he'll be able to overwhelm Ukraine. I think he's wrong in that. Even if American support fades, I think Ukraine can do just fine on its so it won't be able to liberate territory, but it'll be able to hold the territory it has. It'll be able to remain an independent, sovereign country. But I would hope that this summer the administration will rethink its position and will not just adopt a more balanced negotiating stance, but will support Ukraine with a new tranche of arms and continued intelligence. And by the way, if they do that, I actually think the chance of President Trump getting the peace deal he wants goes up dramatically. Vladimir Putin has to be persuaded that time is not his friend, that the West will not fall off of supporting Ukraine. If and when Putin learns that, however reluctantly, then continuing the war doesn't make a lot of sense for him. So again, I think the best way to get to peace is for the United States to make clear that we're prepared to support Ukraine. And again, not to liberate its land militarily, but to be able to defend itself. And by the way, that aid has to continue even after a ceasefire, because the last thing, Congressman, we want is for there to be a ceasefire that turns out to be a pause, and then Russia invades yet again. So we need to make sure that Russia never sees the military option as attractive. And if we do that, and if we go for a simple ceasefire, essentially a ceasefire in place, and maybe we would insert, the Europeans are willing to do it, some peacekeeping forces, a stabilization force in between the two sides, I actually think we could get a peace that takes hold and that endures for years. And at some point, we will have a Russian leadership, I would predict, that is prepared to negotiate a reasonable peace with Ukraine, because one day we'll have a Russian leadership that wants to cease being a pariah, will want Russia to reintegrate with the global economy, with Europe, with the United States. That may take time. It's certainly not Vladimir Putin.
Right.
May not even be his successor. But again, as we've seen on the Korean Peninsula or on Cyprus, ceasefires can last for 50 or more years. So we may be looking at a long-term ceasefire. This is not a perfect situation. It's not as good as a fair and just peace, but it's a hell of a lot better than continued war.
Okay, I'm getting a lot of questions about the Middle East right now, and you were an envoy. You were an envoy to the Middle East, so you are probably one of the foremost experts here. Help us understand what's happening here, and how do we get to, like, today, the New York Times published some very moving pieces about Gaza, and of course we are strong friends of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
Please tell us your thoughts about this as well.
Look, the Middle East, for anyone from California, is recognizable. It's a piece of geology with multiple fault lines. In California, they're physical fault lines that cause earthquakes. In the Middle East, they're political fault lines, and and you've got any number of them inside countries, but obviously you've got the ones in Gaza. You got West Bank, Lebanon, Iran, Houthis. Middle East is a complex part of the world that all too often is defined by conflict. But there you have it. In terms of Gaza, look, October 7th is now 18, 19 months ago, a horrific day of terrorism that took over nearly 2,400 or so lives, several hundred hostages. Israel has responded often in ways that have not, I would argue, sufficiently discriminated or distinguished between Hamas and the population. So tens of thousands of people in Gaza have lost their lives. You finally got to a ceasefire early this year. I think it was January, if my dates are right. And the idea was a three-phase ceasefire. The first phase called for hostage, limited, I think dozens of hostages to be released, to be returned home. Far larger number of Palestinian prisoners being held in Israeli jails to be released. Some extra food and humanitarian supplies to go in and so forth. And that was agreed to in January. And that held for about 2 months. It was implemented. And then around middle of March or so, it broke down. Each side blames the other. My own view is, in this case, Israel might have been more responsible than not. What the second phase of the ceasefire was meant to do was bring about not just a continued cessation of hostilities, not just additional hostage and prisoner releases, but also was to bring about a permanent end to fighting and bring about an Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. I think there was reluctance in the Israeli coalition and government to go down that path because Hamas still remained, as we've seen, a force in much diminished, but still a force in Gaza. So hostilities resumed in mid to late March. And again, a lot of people have lost their lives. Also, at times, food and other humanitarian supplies have been withheld. So a bad situation has gotten worse. And there haven't been more hostage returns. Let's just be blunt about it. That's where we are. And just this week, the Israeli government announced a planned escalation of its policy to essentially force the roughly 2 million or so Palestinians of Gaza into a slice of Gaza, not to be permitted access to all of it. There will be renewed, more intense military operations. And I think we're looking at an open-ended Israeli occupation rather than an Arab force coming in there, rather than a larger political process being started. I think what we're now looking at is open-ended hostilities with an Israeli occupation. Some talk of settlement of parts of Gaza. That's unclear. What worries me is I don't think there's much of any chance for the hostages to be released, certainly not alive. The Israeli argument is that only by this pressure will that come about, possibly, but so far at least, almost all the hostages to be released have come out through negotiation, not through rescue or any other way. So I'm worried about where things are headed. We always like to think as optimists that things sometimes get worse before they get better. Well, in the Middle East, sometimes things get worse before they get even worse. And I'm not sanguine that this situation is going to work out. And what complicates things even more is I'm also worried that the dynamics on the West Bank, what Israelis call Judea and Samaria, where 3 million, not 2 million Palestinians live, that things there are getting rougher, much more conflict and violence there. There's two pieces of good news in the Middle East or today or this week. One is that the president today announced a kind of mutual stand down or climb down between the Houthis and the United States. That would be a good thing if it actually comes about and endures. And second of all, you've got these intriguing negotiations going on between the United States and Iran. And the goal is to make sure that Iran does not acquire a nuclear weapon, and I would say shouldn't even be close to it. We want to make sure that it's not even remotely near the threshold of nuclear weapons, and the details are to be negotiated. But I think Iran's weak economy and Israeli military prowess, what happened in April and October, the demonstration that Israel could act over Iranian territory with near freedom, with impunity, if you will. What Israel did to Hezbollah, the demise of the regime in Syria, the degradation of Haass, all of these have, created a very changed atmosphere. And the good news is the changes on the ground and militarily seem to be at least creating the possibility of a diplomatic breakthrough with Iran on the nuclear front. unfortunately, do not seem to be creating the possibility of a diplomatic breakthrough between Israel and Hamas or the Palestinian Authority.
Wow. Okay. Let me ask you this question. We have a couple few questions about Qatar. Why does the U.S. trust Qatar so much, given what the Saudis and UAE have a policy of not dealing, given that the Saudis and UAE have a policy of not dealing with Qatar since they fund extremism in the region? What is your take on this?
Qatar or Qatar, however you want to pronounce it. Yeah, it's controversial for lots of reasons. That they are associated often with groups that travel in, if you will, in the world of the Muslim Brotherhood, groups, connections to Hamas. Though again, Israel was comfortable using Qatar as a go-between to fund Hamas when that was Israeli policy to do so. It's also an important military partner of the United States. Look, Qatar has basically made it its business to have ties to everyone. And at times that can be useful, and at times that can be, shall we say, exasperating. And I think that is the reality. In my view, is when they do things that we believe are constructive, we should encourage it. And if we ever see or learn that they do things that are not, we've obviously got to push back and try to bring it to an end. But from what I can see, their recent role has been more constructive than not. And even their relationship with the Saudis and others, which a few years ago was totally non-existent, has improved somewhat, as I understand it.
Richard, tell us, what like there's a lot of restlessness right now about what people perceive to be the administration or the executive branch kind of exceeding its powers on a number of fronts. Obviously, in foreign policy, it's given a lot of discretion, but I think people feel that there are excesses, especially with regard to tariffs and other actions. What is your view with regard to the administration in terms of pushing the boundaries, and what can ordinary people do, constituents or Americans do, to kind of push back or kind of
Sure.
get them back within the 40-yard lines or whatever you want to call it?
Okay, let's break it down into two areas. Because it's a big question. It's one of the questions that I wrestle with most and hear most. In terms of foreign policy, you've got it exactly right. Under the Constitution, under American political tradition, the executive enjoys enormous discretion or latitude when it comes to foreign policy. Lots of historical reasons for that. I won't bother you with it and take the time now. But that's not new to this administration or any other. So I don't think that's the area of departure. The area of departure, as you suggest, is much more domestic. The use of executive orders on the scale, both the number, but also the subject matter of them. Also, the pressure being exerted on institutions in the society. And taking a step back, the notion of checks and balances is central to American democracy. But checks and balances take place in three different worlds. One is the world of the federal government. And I would simply say the organ of government you're part of, the Congress, which is Article 1 of the Constitution, has all but disappeared. And I don't mean that to insult you. I'd say that with the Republican majority in both chambers, the Congress is not meeting its constitutional obligations. So there's no check and balance. And the president is obviously more than comfortable with the added running room that it gives him. To the extent there's a check and balance in the executive branch, it comes from the courts, Article 3. And some decisions go against the president, some rein him in, some don't, and some empower him. So I think it'll just continue to be, it depends. Very few issues have reached the Supreme Court, but there's that. I mean, there's that process playing out. There's the second area between the federal government and state and local. And there again, there are certain tensions. And we're seeing it, Governor of Maine and others, Governor of California are trying to figure out where they can push back against Washington. And then there's the larger check and balance in the society where independent institutions, that's central to the fabric of American democracy. And what we're seeing is the pressure being placed on institutions of higher learning, universities. We're seeing it with law firms. We're seeing it with media outlets and so forth. And again, some are choosing to push back and fight, which I believe is admirable, and others are choosing to capitulate. And I would simply say, being a diplomat, that is less admirable. So that's where we are. But I worry, and I here we are. We're in May of 2025. We're 14 months, almost to the day, away from the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And in some ways, American democracy is being tested as rarely, if ever, before. And I recently wrote a book called The Bill of Obligations, and the whole argument is that American democracy ultimately thrives from the bottom up. We the people is central to our democracy. And so you ask what people can do. Well, people can speak to their elected representatives, whether it's the president, whether it's their governors, their senators, their congressmen, their mayors, what have you, and let it be known what they want to see or what they don't want to see and how their political behavior will alter accordingly. They can stand by institute if you're a partner in a law firm, if you're an alumnus of a university, if you're affiliated with, you read this or that newspaper, you can make your preferences known. So again, I understand why people feel frustrated, and others can speak out as well. Americans go to churches and synagogues and mosques and temples in great number. Well, preachers have a responsibility to preach. Teachers have a responsibility to teach. CEOs have certain responsibilities. Labor union leaders do. Parents do. We all do. So at the end of the day, American democracy can't be a spectator sport. It's got to be all hands on deck. So I understand why some areas people feel powerless. I do.
I feel like, sorry to interrupt. I think that some people they feel fear, but I think Richard, having made a career standing up to bullies in Congress, I feel like when you show fear, if a bully knows that you are fearful, they'll bully you more. And you need to speak up and speak out. What do you think about that? Obviously, you study this on a much bigger scale in foreign policy, but I feel like that's true about a lot of things.
Well, again, I believe in speaking out when I disagree. I'm always pleased when I see others doing it. I also think one should be, when one sees things you agree with, one should say so. I actually think the administration deserves credit for certain things. So I think your criticisms have much more weight when people are willing to point out some of the corrections that were made. You may not like where I go. I don't know enough about you, but I think what the administration has done on the border, the basic policy was called for. I think some of the movement away from identity politics was called for. So I do have doubts about the wisdom of government funding of PBS and NPR. As much as I like watching PBS and listening to NPR, I'm not sure they ought to be government funded. I like shower heads that deliver a lot of water, and I like paper straws. There are things that are going on, some of which I think are commendable. But when people disagree, I think they should speak out, and I think you're right. As Columbia University learned the hard way, giving in doesn't necessarily end the conversation. Now, if you're Harvard and you push back, that doesn't end the conversation either. So you've got to be prepared to see it through. But I would think the stakes are enormous. And there could be also certain strength in numbers. So I saw recently that a number of colleges and universities got together. And I think things like that are healthy. And if people in the Congress, ideally the day will come when it will cross partisan lines, when people will say, look, we disagree on this or this policy, but we also agree on this basic tenet of democracy. So I'm hoping that that is not unrealistically idealistic to think that that day may arrive.
Let me ask you some audience questions. Um, I have deep problems with what DOGE has done across our government, but especially with USAID.
Yeah.
It appears that we are basically eliminating our presence in Africa by shutting down USAID programs there. What is your take on this situation? I think from a competition with the CCP standpoint, this is exactly what the CCP wants, but please tell us your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I wish DOGE were really about government efficiency. And if the president had simply said to every cabinet member, you're instructed to find 10 or 15% cuts in your building, everyone could have done that. There's no business that can't tighten its belt, but that's not what DOGE is doing. It's not interested in reforming the Agency for International Development. It's interested in gutting it. And lives will be lost as a result around the world. And influence is being lost. And as you say, China will be one of the great beneficiaries. The funding that's being cut for the Centers for Disease Control, the National Institutes of Health, talk about short-sighted. This is, I think, just stunningly, we're sabotaging our own future. Let's call it what it is. Some of our policies with universities doing the same thing. Universities with federal funding have been the great engines of innovation. Intellectual breakthroughs then lead to commercial breakthroughs and jobs and economic growth. Some of our immigration policy is going to scare off the human talent that this country needs. We are going to basically promote the growth of other countries. Why? Because so many of the best and brightest are going to leave, and they're going to go to Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Europe, and in some cases, China. And they're going to say, we no longer have the ability to stay in the United States. We can no longer get the research funding that we depend on. So we're going to, as LeBron James once said, take our talents elsewhere. And that is, so that's what we're doing. So we are going to undermine our own competitiveness over time. So much of what DOGE is doing, I think, is unbelievably short-sighted.
I guess in our remaining minutes, what do you give us some hope? What do you find kind of hopeful, or what do you feel people should remember as we kind of go through what many people feel is a very challenging time, either personally or as a country, or both right now?
Look, it is a challenging time. And when we have these kinds of sober conversations, I hope the reaction is not to feel paralyzed, not to feel powerless, but just the opposite, to feel urgency. And more people have to get involved. I still find it amazing that upwards of 80 million eligible voters didn't bother to vote last November. If nothing else, Americans ought to have learned that elections have consequences. There are differences between and among candidates. So I would hope that more people would get involved. We've got, I live in New York. There's elections coming up here shortly. In just over a year, there's the midterms and so forth. So the politics aren't ending. Now there's things to be done there. All the things we just talked about. Everybody has associations. And what de Tocqueville remarked about when he visited America, whether it's in religious institutions, schools, places of employment, what have you. So leverage those and talk to people and get involved. And if you work, people who are associated with universities and the rest ought to get them to stand up. If people may want to contribute more to nonprofits in ways that, or to in ways that could, again, create some checks and balances in the society. I also feel, by the way, optimistic about technology and so forth. There's so much innovation in this country, and we got through COVID because of a new generation of vaccines and because of Zoom. What were you and I are talking now? Otherwise, we would have had to make fateful choices every day. So I'm excited about our ability to innovate and integrate new technologies. But I understand, again, the frustration, the fear, the powerlessness. But again, history shows that one of the things that makes democracies what they are is the ability to self-correct. And I think there's lots of entry points for Americans who want to make a difference.
Finally, foreign policy. I mean, you've studied this for decades. You were a practitioner in government, one of our foremost diplomats. Why should someone care about foreign policy? Why? How do you make it something that relates to people's everyday lives? And how should people consume it? Like, what is it? What are the best ways to kind of think about this, consume it, and direct it as an average citizen?
I understand. Look, the first half is, I get it. It's called foreign policy. So by definition, it's something out there. It's a little bit, what I like to do is I think about it a little bit as like oxygen. We don't notice it until, in this case, order in the world. But, we've learned the hard way historically when there's conflicts other places, they can find their way to us. Or, you had a country like Afghanistan, which couldn't control its own territory. Groups like the Taliban set up shop, and the next thing we knew, we had 9/11. We have, 20 million Americans died because of a virus that broke out in Wuhan, China. We can debate how it broke out. I'm of the mind that it broke out of a lab, others aren't. But regardless, what happens there doesn't stay there. Foreign policy can be a great opportunity. If you're a farmer, you're a soybean farmer, well, guess what? Our ability to export soybeans to China could fundamentally affect your livelihood. We could go on, but there's so many ways in which the world affects us. We affect the world. A lot of people, I get it, would say, yeah, but we can't afford it. Well, guess what? We can. What we are spending on foreign policy and defense now, national security, as big as those numbers are, it's only roughly half the average we spent during the Cold War as a percentage of our economic output. So we can afford it. We can have guns and butter. We can do both. And the problems here at home, by the way, many of them aren't caused by a lack of spending. We spend more per student on education than any other country in the world. And the last I checked, our SAT scores don't reflect it. We spend twice on healthcare what every other wealthy country in the world does. And the last I checked, we're not twice as healthy and we don't live twice as long. So in many cases, our problems aren't dollars. It's how we spend them. And so those are the conversations we ought to have. But the bottom line is, by withdrawing from the world, it doesn't mean the world's going to leave us alone. We're going to lose opportunities, and we're going to buy into a lot of threats if we do that. And now and how to consume foreign policy. Look, there's lots of ways. The organization I headed for 20 years, the Council on Foreign Relations, has a website, cfr.org. That's the best teaching tool about foreign policy of any website in the country. It's basically the best place to learn about the world. The magazine the council publishes, Foreign Affairs, is the best place to get serious analysis of what's going on. But then you've also got now, you've got a couple of major newspapers, the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, the New York Times, and so forth, that cover the world really thoroughly. There's any number of podcasts. There's a lot of information out there. So if you want it, it's kind of like Field of Dreams. You'll find it. And but to me, and also what I would hope, is that our schools would look at what they teach. I would love increasingly for every young American, for high school or college, they'd be required to take a course on civics. But I would also love for them to be exposed to a course on things international. We ought to really be focusing on what kinds of literacy we want to encourage in our young people. I'd say financial literacy, civics literacy, information literacy, international literacy. We want to graduate young people who are ready to thrive both domestically and internationally.
Wow. Well, Richard, thank you so much for spending time with us, both on behalf of the committee, the CCP committee, as well as on behalf of all the people tuning in from our constituency and across the country. You're a treasure for our country in terms of your expertise, your experience, and and your service. And so we're just so honored, and I look forward to talking to you again. And thank you to everyone for tuning in as well. And God bless. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman.
Thank you, sir.